So, Yvette, you are one of the leading lights of the Labour movement. You are a proud feminist. You have always been a tremendous supporter of Labour Women's Network. You have always been tremendously sisterly to other women coming through the Labour movement, and somehow, staggeringly, in May it will be a full quarter of a century since you were first elected to the House of Commons. So we really look forward when Abena is back safely with us to exploring the highs and lows of your career, to finding out what it was like to stand for leader, a bit more about your current work on the front bench, particularly obviously with the refugee crisis at the moment and all the great work you're doing on violence against women. But first of all, you've been dancing this weekend, I believe. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Yvette Does Strictly?
Thank you, Claire. It's fantastic to see everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really lovely to be able to be here and to talk to everybody. I confess, been having my Strictly fantasy this weekend, where I got to dance for a Strictly fundraiser for Rob Burrow, who's a former Leeds Rhino player, whose family all from my constituency, and who has motor neuron disease and is doing a phenomenal job fundraising for motor neuron disease and for a new MND centre for the north of England, a world-beating centre, and they decided to put on a Strictly ball. And so I have been learning an American smooth waltz for the last few weeks, which has been the best fun ever. I got to have my first ever spray tan and my first ever false eyelashes, and then to just dance and have great fun. And I had lots of tips from Ed. However, what I figured was, much as I might not have been sympathetic enough to Ed when he was doing proper Strictly, he never had to dance in heels. And that was definitely the hardest bit of all.
That's the great quote about Ginger Rogers, isn't it? Is that she did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards in heels for a lesser place in history, which is one of the reasons we want to host Zooms like this with the eminent women in the Labour movement, particularly in Women's History Month, but year round, because obviously women tend to be somewhat written out of political history. But you have more than earned your place within it. But we sort of wanted to allow you the opportunity to kind of begin the writing of your own history of your initial contribution to Parliament, to politics, to life in the shape of the Labour Party. What would you say in their eyes, and what would you say you're most proud of during the first quarter of a century of your life in Parliament?
I know, it makes it feel a long time. I think it also feels even longer because of COVID, so that just distorts all of our sense of time as well. I mean, look, obviously there's nothing that matches being in a Labour government and actually being able to do things and being a minister in a Labour government and being able to change things, you know, rather than just sort of campaigning desperately for things, but not actually having the power to change things. So that, I mean, was a real just privilege to be part of a Labour government that was doing things. We got to do, I mean, there were so many different things that I was involved in at different stages. I was the minister in charge of the cancer plan and the coronary heart disease national service framework. Those two things alone have saved huge numbers of lives across the country ever since, because we introduced the 2-week wait for cancer. We introduced the all the standards and timetables for coronary heart disease, a big increase in statins, all of those sorts of things that saved lives. So things like that. There was one of the things that I pushed for personally was free fruit in schools, and there's still kids that are getting free fruit in their primary schools and their infant schools because of the work that we did. And the reason we did it was because we've got research which said there were loads of kids who were eating no fruit and veg at all in a week. And just by being able to introduce that free fruit, as a child who grew up with free milk before Margaret Thatcher, the milk snatcher, took it away. It was just felt like a really good thing to do. It's just something as simple as that is still in place even now. We did have the press officer in the health department very enthusiastically coming out saying, I've got, I know you want to find a way to make reference back to Margaret Thatcher, the milk snatcher. Here's my idea. We'll say Margaret Thatcher, milk snatcher, Tony Blair, free pair. As was ridiculous.
My kids have been among the beneficiaries of those free pears and apples, and I have to say it buys me a couple of minutes blessed peace at home on the school run. So, for no other reason than that, we are very grateful.
But I think it was actually, I thought so many different things, but actually the thing that's probably the most important, and it was a team, effort. I was one of the ministers that was involved in it, along with David Blunkett, Tessa Jowell, Margaret Hodge and others, was Sure Start. And that's the thing I think made such a massive difference to so many families, and it's just tragic, totally appalling the way it's been rowed back on since then.
Absolutely, but what a creation that was. I mean, that alone would have been a significant contribution. We try to shy away in Labour Women's Network from obsessing about the women who come first in any particular role, because actually those who come second, third, fourth are often therefore written out of history. But you were the first woman Chief Secretary to the Treasury. You were, I think, the first woman sitting minister to take maternity leave. What did those signify to you?
So the Chief Secretary was that you couldn't but be reminded of it, because in the Chief Secretary's office in the Treasury and in the private office, they have a wall of pictures of former Chief Secretaries going back 30, 40 years, just a whole grid of all of these Chief Secretaries. So they were all men. And so you have this whole row of not just a whole wall full of men's pictures. And I remember actually when I arrived in the Treasury, where I followed on from Andy Burnham, and Andy, it was right at the height of, we were just getting into the height of the financial crisis, and Andy was moving from the Treasury to become Secretary of State for DCMS. And I met him in the corridor. So as I was arriving at the office and Andy was leaving, and he just gave me a big hug, said, yeah, well, I've left a brief on nationalising Northern Rock on your desk, and I'm off to the football. And there he was off to enjoy the DCMS role, while we had to kind of carry on dealing with the challenges of the financial crisis at that time. And that was, kind of, I think people will look back at history and just see, the work that Gordon Brown did, the international work to get us through the financial crisis. The work we later did, and because I then moved on to be the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, we had a huge amount of work with the Future Jobs Fund to make sure that the experience for young people of the financial crisis wasn't like what happened in the 1980s and in the early 90s, when we had soaring youth unemployment, and we managed to prevent that, but it was only because of the active work that the Labour government did at that time. And so I think that was kind of probably really important period. The experience of taking maternity leave was really interesting, because I took maternity leave twice as a minister. And the first time, so it was the first time it had ever been done, and nobody really knew how it should work. And I asked the permanent secretary for the department, the health department, he didn't know. He asked the cabinet secretary, he didn't know. He said, well, technically you're not actually an employee, you're an appointee, you're the Queen's appointee as a minister. And nobody thought it was a good idea to ask the Queen how we should do it. So that we just literally had to, in that classic fudge way that very often we do things and first make things happen, we were pretty much making it up as we went along. And I decided what we should do is take the 6 months, which was how long civil servants had at that time, and take sort of 6 months, effectively 6 months paid leave. But of course you can't as an MP in the same way. So we're still keeping all of the constituency stuff going, but did at least mean that I was taking maternity leave from the department. We didn't get it right, and we We didn't have proper cover arrangements, so responsibilities were shared out. So it actually became kind of a bit, but the department did provide me with a huge amount of support, and everybody was trying to make it work, and that was great. Second time I took maternity leave was what's now the Communities and Local Government department, and actually that was much harder. And the department wasn't supportive. It was a sort of made it very hard for me to keep in touch with what was going on, even despite the fact that I'd be coming back into it 6 months later. They wouldn't share any papers with me, wouldn't, even just for me to just know what was going on and what other ministers were doing while I wasn't there, really made it very difficult. And when I came back again, effectively had no private office to come back into. They'd just sort of taken everybody away, and there were, it was like, it wasn't quite 2 members of staff and a stool, but it almost felt a bit like that coming back into it. And that was much harder. And after that, we decided what we would do. We needed to formalise this and have proper arrangements in place so that you couldn't have this just really haphazard arrangement in place. And so we did that. There was a whole programme of work. Cabinet Secretary was very supportive, and they drew up proper rules for ministers taking maternity leave. But by the time Jo Swinson took maternity leave, many years later in the coalition government, those rules had all been lost. And neither Jo nor her office could find them anywhere. And so it's still just kind of had a sense of there'd be a surge of good intentions, but it wasn't properly institutionalized. It wasn't properly embedded as, of course, ministers take maternity leave. Of course, ministers should take paternity leave, because of course, this should be just like any other thing. And we should be providing some leadership for the rest of the country and making sure these sorts of things work.
Which, if you look at the history of women in the Labour movement, is so typical. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And of course, we're still, trying to model exactly what good parental leave policies should look like for people across all forms of public life. I believe that Abena has safely escaped the fire alarm in the Norman Shaw North corridor of Parliament and is with us. Abena, are you there?
Hi, I am, and I'm still alive. Thank you for holding the fort, Claire. I just wanted to say thank you for that, but I also just wanted to go back to your points, where you're talking about the maternity leave and the difficulties that you face. Because when you came in, you were part of the historic 109 women Labour MPs that joined the House in '97, and it was a Labour government at the time. Are you able to talk about the comparisons to where we've got so far now? Because obviously Stella Creasy has also spoke about her experiences in terms of maternity leave, and obviously it's not just maternity leave which is important, but also people with other caring responsibilities. Do you think that the House still has a way to go, even though as a party we've got 51%, at least 51% of the RPLP is female MPs? So more and more women are looking to go into politics. What can be done to change the narrative to make it more kind of accessible?
So I think we have come a long way since then, and I think that that big increase in women MPs in 1997 did make a big difference. And it meant, even just as for example, when I was having difficulties with maternity leave the second time, I went to see Harriet Harman, and Harriet Harman talked to other women ministers, and there were enough women MPs in that point to be able to make sure to provide support to make sure that we could make progress. And I think that would have been much harder for if it had been 10 years previously. So I'm sure that made a big difference. I think it is always, as Claire said, a bit 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But then partly because we're always wanting to be focusing on the issues in terms of maternity leave right across the country. And you can very often feel actually, well, it shouldn't just be about us. What we should be thinking about is maternity leave across the country and increasing that. And we were doing a great job increasing that. And so I think it would very often be that we would sort of deal with issues around maternity leave and so on in Parliament or in ministerial roles and so on, almost as a late thing because we have to, but actually that was partly because our focus, you know, was on making massive changes for women right across the country, most of whom were actually facing much greater difficulties in the workplace or in terms of managing things than certainly than we were as ministers. But as a result of that, often change can feel much slower within public life and within politics than perhaps it ought to, because you feel, well, we ought to be able to sort it out. You know, if we're in politics, we ought to be able to sort it out for ourselves. And actually, we often end up, I think, doing the opposite. I mean, I think, so Parliament, I think, has made big changes. The arrival of the nursery in Parliament is a very big change compared to what it was certainly when my kids were small. We still got, I think, quite a way to go, and also involving dads in that discussion and involving carers and looking more widely at the kind of family support is really important, and makes it really important for people to be able to think about getting involved in politics and doing things. But the other thing I guess I would say as well is because often I know, you know, people I talk to feel put off from going into politics, not simply because of some of those structural issues, but also because of thinking, well, it's just too hard to juggle. And I kind of always figure, actually, most things are possible. They may not be possible all at once. And so sometimes you have to not beat yourself up because it's not possible to do everything all at once. But sometimes, you know, we end up not doing things because we think we can't do them in a really, you know, really as well as we would like to do them. But actually, there's a bunch of men who are doing them nowhere near as good as we might in a, you know, juggling way. And therefore, actually, we also just need to just encourage people to have a go and to find ways to make things work and support each other in doing so.
That's really helpful, and I completely agree with you in terms of not just looking at, as MPs, looking across the boards, because, you know, local councillors as well, there's been real issues with regards to baby leave, which is something that LWN has been really campaigning on to make sure that all public offices is supported. And also, I remember when a creche was brought into Parliament, you know, whilst it's expensive, I do think that it is some sort of progressive steps. I also wanted to talk about a bit more about you, just to kind of go into a deep dive, basically. I don't want to make you blush, Yvette, but, you know, academically you are, as a student, you were fiercely bright, and you could have gone to any arena in the field. You could have even gone to Prime Minister. I mean, yes. But what experiences really kind of motivated you to really dedicate your life to Labour politics and public service? Because I think a lot of people in the room who may be considering going into politics may be interested to hear a bit more about what it was that was your trigger point.
So I guess my family was probably always political, as in would always talk about political issues. My dad was a trade union official. My mum's family was mining family, so always strong Labour. And I remember, it was like the Nigel Lawson budgets of the late 80s, which I remember coming home from school and my mum being almost in tears because it was one of the budget that had announced a big tax cut for the richest people in the country, and it was effectively a pensions cut because it was freezing the rates at the time when there was inflation and for pensioners. And my great auntie Liz, who was really struggled to make ends meet, she'd brought up 2 kids on her own, and to her niece and nephew as well after their parents died. Mining community, she'd, you know, just always worked incredibly hard and never had a proper pension, and she was one of those matriarchs of the family, and she was going to have even less money and be really struggling because she didn't even have a full state pension. And my mum being sort of in tears of anger about that. And so I think that sense of injustice and inequality, I guess, was sort of always something that was part of what we talked about at home, or what, you know, you had a really strong feeling about. So I guess I would always have expected to be kind of wanting the world to change and wanting to do jobs that were about changing things or about trying to tackle injustice and inequality. If I'm honest, I ended up as an MP, just slightly tumbled into it because other women encouraged me to do so. And it was actually, a run up to the 97 election, and it was Ruth Kelly and Lorna Fitzsimons, who had been selected as candidates already for the 97 election, just said to me, "Oh, have a go, you should have a go." And I thought, well, I suppose I should have a go, but I thought I was having a go, but actually I wouldn't get very far. And then maybe I might have another go again in 10 years time or something like that. But, well, you know, Ruth and Lorna had said, go on, have a go, do something. And so I went for selection and was, to my huge surprise, was selected to be a candidate in the 97 election. So it was a combination, I guess, of always wanting to work in a way that was about changing things and about making things better for people, and then the encouragement of other women to get involved and to do things.
It's funny you say that, because I also had to be encouraged as well. Like particularly Claire, smiling to herself, she was one of the people that encouraged me to stand. And you do find that is the case with women encouraging other women to stand for public office. You don't really see many men doing that, to be honest. Speaking of which, in terms of your you know, looking into equality and, you know, wanting to make a difference, your current role as Shadow Home Secretary does allow you to do this. Particularly, you know, at the moment, there are, you know, I know you've been doing a lot of work in relation to violence against women, which is a really big issue. And I was visiting a school in my constituency on Friday, and that was something that a lot of the pupils were talking about. What I wanted to really know is what is the top things that you are working on at the moment that you may want to share with us in the room in terms of policy work, and what do you think we need to do, what are you doing as a party, particularly with Labour, to regain the public's trust, particularly on the party's tough on law and order, and also diminishing confidence in police forces and judiciary systems. As you know, in the chamber today, there was an urgent question on child Q, which, you know, that's, you know, it's horrific what happened to that 15-year-old child, which also shows, you know, the public mood in terms of the trust, particularly with the Black community, with the police. I appreciate I've given you quite a lot to answer in one question, but I thought this might be something you might want to talk more about in terms of your portfolio.
Yeah, so you're right. Just, I mean, so many important issues there. We've got a great team, the Shadow Home Affairs team, because we've got Sarah Jones as Shadow Policing Minister. We've got Holly Lynch as Shadow Security Minister, Naz Shah as Shadow Crime Prevention Minister, and then of course Jess Phillips has been doing such important work on violence against women and girls for such a long time, Shadow Safeguarding Minister as well. So it's a really strong team, and tackling violence against women and girls is, I think, right at the heart of what we are doing and want to prioritise. And I think, I mean, my feeling is that there's we've managed to again make some significant changes in the way in which the criminal justice system works, say compared to 25 years ago. And when I was elected, it was only 5 years after marital rape became illegal, which is just incredible to think about, really. You know, 5 years before I was elected, it was still legal to rape someone you were married to. And so, you know, we have had very big changes in terms of attitudes, in terms of legislation, and in terms of support, with all the support for example, the independent domestic abuse advisors and sexual assault advisors, the IDVAs and ISVAs, that the Labour government brought in, and some of the changes, the legal changes that we've been campaigning for from opposition ever since. So I did the work with Jan Royal on stalking legislation, for example, bringing in the stalking legislation. We did that from opposition, but we still managed to change the law, and there's many more things that you can do. But it still feels to me as if the criminal justice system, in a deep way, just isn't designed around women's lives and just has huge gaps in the way that it works. And one of the most recent examples that I would use on this is I've just managed to get the government to change the law around the 6-month time limit on domestic abuse prosecutions. So in the Magistrates' Court, since forever, there's been a 6-month time limit on prosecuting common assault. Now, you can understand why there might be that kind of time limit on a fight in the street between two people. It's going to the Magistrates' Court and you want to get it through and keep the justice system moving as rapidly as possible and get a response. However, if that's not a fight in the street, but actually it's abuse that's taken place in the home, there are so many reasons why victims of domestic abuse may not be able to report that to the police, may not be able to, where the abuse may be continuing, where they may not be safe, where it may take time for them to be able to leave, for someone who might be worried about the kids, needing to get them settled before she's had the strength to go to the police and shown that bravery, only to be told by the police, no, too late. We've passed the 6-month limit. We're not even going to investigate this because we can't take this to court and get the prosecution. And it's interesting, when I raised this because it had come to me as I actually had a constituency case a couple of years ago. And when I raised it with the government, nobody had even done any research on the scale of the problem. When I raised it, there were actually some of the campaign organisations I raised it with, who said, yeah, we completely agree, of course it ought to change, but we'll never get this changed. It's such an embedded part of the criminal justice system. And so I think it's one of those examples of where the criminal justice system had just been designed for very many years without women being part of it, without women's lives being part of it, and as a result, without understanding properly domestic abuse. And I still think there are lots of examples like that throughout the criminal justice system, throughout policing and the criminal justice system, where you still need to shine a spotlight on that. I give spiking as another example. So spiking drinks doesn't just affect women, but it's predominantly young women who are affected. This has been going on for years without it being taken seriously as a crime. The focus is always on can young women protect themselves, as opposed to, hang on, this is poisoning people. This is a really dangerous crime that is taking place and is not being taken seriously, and just being sort of dismissed as being a bit about young people going out for drinks and, you know, having a good time, whatever, whereas actually it should be taken really seriously as a crime. And now I think the pressure is growing for it to be taken much more seriously. But again, it was just those attitudes that just don't take seriously enough the things that are affecting women's lives. So for me, the approach I think we have to take is actually right across all the work we do. Policing through the criminal justice system has to be about shining that spotlight on and challenging those sorts of injustices, those kinds of hidden assumptions. There's been obviously a lot of concern about some of the cultural issues in policing. We had obviously the Charing Cross awful report about Charing Cross police station, and also obviously Abena, the case we were talking about child Q, which I know everyone would have found really disturbing, of a young black girl being strip searched at her school, and the safeguarding report that describes it. I mean, it's just really distressing. And obviously this has had a really profound and really harmful impact on a child in the worst of ways. And, you know, obviously the challenges we were all, you know, have been making in Parliament today is actually, well, what is the government going to do to address this? How do we get the guidance? How could it possibly be that the guidance and the training was so weak on this, that it was possible for this to happen. Everybody accepts it should never have happened, but how is it possible for the guidance and the training to be so weak that it didn't prevent this kind of thing happening? And I think there are issues around culture, there are issues around overhauling training, overhauling the way in which policing works. But I think there was a question you asked in there about, is there a conflict between us wanting to talk about those kinds of reforms and also wanting to highlight issues around crime, issues around policing across the country, problems with lack of neighbourhood policing and so on. I don't see these things as being in conflict, because I think our strong British tradition has always been policing by consent, and policing should be about keeping us safe, but it also should be about policing by consent and policing having the confidence of communities. That is how you keep communities safe, if you also have confidence. So therefore, I think we can be quite confident about talking about the need for good policing in communities across the country, and also the need to reform policing so that it has continued support and continued policing by consent, and that you can deliver results because you've got the police are the communities are the police. You have that that kind of embedded policing within communities in a strong and effective way.
That's really helpful, and obviously I know you've got a lot on your plate of that in terms of relaying these messages, particularly to about what Labour is going to do differently, particularly in this area. Is there anything that you wanted to say to everyone in the call about what they could do to help amplify the work that you are doing, particularly when it's coming in some areas, local elections, and about how Labour would do things very differently? Because I just feel like the government isn't really doing anything. And my biggest concern is in terms of people really understanding how Labour takes these issues really seriously. Yeah,
so we want to support community safety, and that means all communities. It means the issues that you were talking about as well, Abena, about that means about challenging racism. It means about challenging misogyny. We've got, I think, another vote, I think, in the House of Lords again tomorrow on misogyny. It means that strong sense of all of of policing being embedded in the communities and tackling crime and supporting community safety. Some of the things I think we're going to be talking about in the run-up to the local elections are about how Labour councils do more to support community safety, whether that is about CCTV in town centres, whether it is about support for youth services and crime prevention, whether it's about working with Labour PCCs. We've got evidence that Sarah Jones has been pulling together from right across the country, which shows how much more seriously Labour councils take issues around community safety, and that's something we need to be campaigning on. What we've also been seeing, though, is because of what's happening with the more widely across the criminal justice system, you've got issues now with overall crime going up and yet prosecutions going down, and that's at its most acute when it comes to rape. So now only 1.3% of rapes reach prosecution. And to just give you the sort of stark figures around that, it's estimated that there are around 300 women raped every day. Of those 300 cases, around 150 to 170 will be reported. Of those cases, only around 3 will ever see the inside of a courtroom, never mind the inside of a jail cell. That is a total failure of the criminal justice system to deal with one of the most serious crimes against women and girls. So we are going to be campaigning on the action that we need. Not all forces even have a specialist rape investigation unit. Of course they ought to have a specialist rape investigation unit as complete basics. Rape victims ought to have legal support as well. We also ought to have specialist rape courts to fast track cases because they take forever. So practical reforms we're calling for. In the community level, going for the police to be based back in the communities, back in our neighbourhoods. And that's actually where you also have often the strongest in terms of positive community safety and community focused culture in policing, is when you have strong neighbourhood policing, police back in the communities and supporting neighbourhood hubs as well. Where instead of investing in the Royal Yacht, which even the royal family and the Navy don't want. Put that money instead into neighbourhood hubs across the country to have police working with local council officers, working with local prevention services in order to tackle issues in local communities and to make communities feel safer as well. So those are some of the things we will be calling for and campaigning for in the run-up to the local elections. I think
that's really, really great. Thank you for that, Yvette. Everybody, I'm going to be asking you to get ready to ask Yvette some questions. So if you do have some questions, if you can start thinking about it now and start posting it in the chat or indicate through your hand. But there is one thing that I wanted to really ask you, Yvette, because I remember in 2015 that you put yourself forward for leader of the Labour Party. I voted for you, by the way. I did support you. And I know that it probably wasn't an easy thing to do, particularly to stick your head above and put yourself forward, particularly as we had quite a big defeat around 2015 and the morale was quite low in the party. Do you think that the Labour Party is ready for a female leader? And whether you would consider putting yourself forward. Now, I'm not saying that Keir is going, just want to be very clear about that, but maybe you may want to consider that in the next 25 years, because I don't expect you to be going any soon. I expect you to be there forever and ever, Yvette. So if you want to talk about your experience putting yourself a leader, the challenges that you face, and whether it'd be great if you can answer the question if the party's ready for a female leader. I do know that there was a conversation about it at Women's Conference. I know that Nan, mentioned about the party, about time having a female leader. And, this is something that we get a stick from a lot from the Tories about how Labour has yet to make much progress. And sometimes when I'm speaking to colleagues, I feel a bit frustrated because they're like, it's about ability, when I think there are more than enough capable women in our PLP. And I think some of it's to do with the culture in terms of recognising what a female leader is and how we should view someone as a woman as a leader.
So I think we will have a woman leader. Of course it is an issue for us. I'd say certainly not for want of me and some other women doing their bit at different stages along the way, but I think I think there is an interesting question about how I think for a lot of people, it's a question about whether this is more so for women. It is much easier to stand in a general election than in a selection process. And that includes an internal party election, because in a general election or a local council election, although you're putting yourself forward, you feel like you're also putting the party forward. It's we're doing this together. It's, vote for me, but vote Labour. Whereas when you're standing for a selection, or when you're putting yourself forward for an internal party leadership role, it's much more personal. It's much more just about promoting, arguing for yourself as to why you should be the candidate, why you should be the leader, the person on the NEC, whoever else it might be, as opposed to campaigning for a set of issues, a platform, a mandate, different things. And I think that can feel more difficult and can feel more uncomfortable sometimes if you're not used to, if you don't think in terms of wanting to put yourself forward as opposed to wanting to put ideas forward as well. And we have to kind of encourage women to do so. We have to encourage more women, I think, to put themselves forward and to go through that. We certainly did have in the 2015 election, that was, I think, we would really start to see some of the surge in online abuse at that point. And it's become much more commonplace since. We know the abuse is much worse if you are Black or if you are ethnic minority in different circumstances as well. But we certainly saw kind of additional abusive targeting of women candidates at that time, and we have to I think be very strong about challenging that collectively and not just leaving that to women to challenge that in different ways. But I think there will be lots more brilliant women who will put themselves forward, and I think we will end up with a brilliant woman leader as well. Just say one thing, because it probably brings me back full circle on the Strictly stuff we were talking about at the very beginning. I often got asked in the interviews during that 2015 election about Ed, who had obviously just stood down, or just been defeated in the 2015 election. And we always get in interviews, media interviews, journalists in general tend to ask me one question about Ed, and basically about, whether Ed would actually in fact would be calling all the shots and would be telling me what to do, as if, but they would only ask one question and I would dismiss it and talk about, what nonsense, how completely ridiculous this was, other than on Women's Hour, where they asked me several questions. I mean, Women's Hour of all places, they kept asking me all about Ed, and this was supposed to be an interview about me and the Labour leadership. And so I ended up saying, partly because it had been in my head, because I thought it'd be really funny if Ed did Strictly. And I thought he'd be brilliant at it. And I used it as a throwaway response when they just kept asking me. I said, look, he's more likely to end up doing Strictly. And because I said it was long before there was any suggestion about Ed doing Strictly, but because I said it, then what happened was, I think it was the Sun newspaper suddenly started ringing it. They thought I must have said it deliberately because Ed was about to do Strictly. So they started ringing up the BBC and madly ringing up the BBC. Is it true Ed Balls is doing Strictly? And of course he wasn't. They'd already got their run of people to do Strictly that year. But I still like to claim that that was what put the idea into the BBC's mind, because they had to keep answering questions from journalists who were asking about whether or not Ed Balls was about to do Strictly. And so the following year they did ask him to do Strictly, and we had that series of events that led ultimately to Gangnam Style. So therefore it is possible that in that fluttering of butterfly wings, that in fact, a little bit of sexism in the 2015 leadership election in the end led us to Gangnam Style. So you never quite know where things are going to end up.
Thank you for that. I know, speaking of Strictly, I'm just wondering what other hats you have, if you've got any other hidden talents, Yvette.
No, actually, no.
I'll be watching this space.
Yeah, no, the dancing I really, really liked. That was just great fun. But Ed's been sort of learning piano since he finished in politics, and I just failed to learn. I'm one of those people that tried. My mum really wanted me to learn an instrument and made me try piano and violin, and it was all really bad. It didn't work at all.
Okay, so I've got you some questions about that some people have posted in the chat. Because of the time restrictions, I'm just going to read out the questions that I've summarized. So Harriet, I think you've kind of answered this already. If you hadn't have got to where you are now, would you encourage other women to stand to be an MP? I think you've answered that question.
I completely would. Yeah, I would completely would. It is a mad job. It is a completely mad job, but it's also just brilliant. I mean, you just get to help people. You get to do all kinds of different things. We've got there's a lad who's looking after his younger brother who's had a really tough time, and we've just got all of these housing problems sorted out for him, and just the bits of constituency stuff that you get to sort out. There's nothing to match it, I think. So have a go, become a councillor, you'd be brilliant. Whatever, become an MP, you'd be brilliant.
Okay, that's great. I've got some more questions. I'm going to do them in rounds of 2, if that's okay. So the first one is from Claire. How do you make the party as a whole more welcoming environment for women? Because I know from experience that some of the CLPs can be quite toxic, and there's been cultures in the party. I've experienced it myself, where it can be a toxic environment for women and puts them off getting involved. The second one is from Hannah. Holland. I'm the Women's Officer of my University Labour's Club, and we struggle to get women to join very male-dominated club. How do we encourage more young women to join with politics? While you're preparing for that, I'm just going to answer a question from Joe Brown. That's okay. So Joe Brown was talking about the costs, about the expenses involved in running to be an MP. As Joe, I'm not sure if you're aware, the NEC have changed the rules where in terms of, it depends on the membership of the numbers of your CLP, where you could be spending 1 to 4,000. It used to be a lot more than that. And I also have to say LWN really drove and pushed the party to readdress this, to make it more accessible, particularly from underrepresented groups, for women, ensuring caring responsibilities. And in addition to that, the selection process is much shorter now, where it's gonna be done within 5 weeks. I've known selection processes to go on for a long time. I've known people that have personally spent as much as like 17K to run for selections and not be selected and got into financial debt. So I do believe the party is in a better place. And I do believe that's down to LWN, particularly committee members like Claire Reynolds and Nan Sloan, who've really been driving this, and they've been the thorn, I don't believe it's the thorn, but really making the party understand that this is an issue that needs to be sorted out if we want to have diverse candidates stand in the next election. Sorry, so over to you, Yvette.
Yeah.
Once I drink some water.
I think some of the experiences that people have had in particular local parties or particular local meetings, you know, where there has been either abuse or sort of toxic culture thing, it's really damaging, and we just have to do everything we can to stamp that out. And it's damaging for women, but it's damaging for everybody, and it means that it just goes against the values of the Labour Party. So I think he has been very firm on not standing for any of that kind of behaviour or things happening. And so whenever there are examples of it, I think there has to be very firm action against it. And I mean, I think women's forums are really important in terms of getting more women involved. And I think I didn't write down the name of the person who asked about the university, who said she was a women's officer at a university group, but it's a kind of constant reminder actually of that this is continuous. This is a continuous process actually with every generation of encouraging, making sure that it's every forum is friendly and open to women, and that women can get involved and not feel like it's they're not going to be welcome as well. And you can do it. The challenge with the university is you can have a huge effort goes in, and then the third years leave, and then suddenly it's starting the whole process all over again, which is why it has to be a continual and active process to do it. I mean, in some ways, actually, I think you probably have better ideas than we would have now about actually what might make the greatest difference right now in terms of what the issues are. The interesting thing, and again, sometimes it can be actually, I think, the issues that are focused on or the way in which the organising takes place. So just for example, I had a discussion at the sixth form college in my constituency, and you'd sometimes do the events, and the boys would talk more or get involved more, and we ended up talking about violence against women, and I raised the issue about spiking and asked them about spiking, and just like suddenly just huge surge of interest and talking about it and so on. So sometimes I think it can also be about what the issues are that we get everybody talking about, can also make it easier to get more women involved.
Fantastic. I think we've just got time for just one more question. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get through to everyone's question, but there's one question from Fatima about welcoming women from ethnic minorities to engage in politics. any thoughts on what could be done?
So this is, I think, probably is hugely important for right across the country as well. I think we've seen some great stuff, for example, in London, but actually we need right across the country as well to be getting more women from different ethnic minority backgrounds into politics and into active Labour politics, into leadership roles as well, crucially into leadership roles. Some of this is about the support and about the encouragement and about having brilliant role models. And, you know, in Abena and in Naz and in so many other women in Parliament now, I think we've got amazing role models, but we have to make the most of that. And we have to encourage more women to be involved and be active about noticing when there is discrimination, when there is when you get some of the sort of harassment online or all of those kinds of things as well, and always challenging it. But I think this is about both the grassroots encouragement and also the support for women in leadership roles as well.
Thank you. I'm very honoured that you called me a role model, Yvette.
Absolutely. 100%.
I believe you're a role model. I'm really sorry, everyone, but we're going to have to draw this meeting to a close. I'm sure, like me, you found this conversation with Yvette very inspiring, and watch this space in the next 25 years. You may see Yvette become the next leader of the Labour Party if Keir steps down. Just want to be clear, do not start a rumour mill that I'm saying I'm plotting for Yvette, because that would not go down well. And I also want to say the work that Labour did in government, Yvette, that you did, I think it's very inspiring, and that we just need to work towards getting a Labour government, because we can't really deliver change until you are the Home Secretary, which would be fantastic. And I hope with everybody, please support us in terms of LWN. It's a voluntary-led organisation which is done by volunteers. So if you can donate, that would be fantastic, because we want to get as many women selected as parliamentary candidates or other positions within the party, because the only way we can change things is if we have women in these spaces. So follow us on social media, be sisterly, and as Yvette mentioned earlier, in terms of supporting other women in politics, you know, grassroots activism is the best way forward. And we know that it is challenging in your CLPs, it can be challenging within the Labour Party, but being a sister goes a really long way in terms of making sure the voices of key women are heard within the Labour Party Labour Party movement. I just want to say that we do have a residential parliamentary selection training course coming up in Derby in May. So there is still time to put yourself forward, or put other women to put themselves forward as well. And I think Claire's going to post it in the chat. I just want to say thank you, Yvette, for doing this. Thank you for all the sisters in the room that came and was sisterly. Thank you to Claire and Jane for all their work, organising this. And also thank you to other members of the executive committee. I think I see in the call Nan Sloan, Kieran, Nan, who is the author of all these training courses. And if you haven't met Nan, you should, but don't lobby her all on social media. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, so thank you.
Brilliant, thank you for having me. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks.
And thank you all for coming, sisters. That link to our training is in the comments there if you would like to join us in Derby.